Evening, everyone. That is loud. It's good. It's a lot, but louder than it was last night. Okay, good evening, everybody. We're gonna be, having a special meeting for the details around the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation as it relates to Stroudsburg and Marion Township. First order of business is to do the Pledge of Allegiance, but if everybody will indulge me, I'm actually gonna turn that down. Thank you. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Okay, that's better. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As always, the meetings are recorded, audio and video. We ask that everybody please use your silence for your cell phones so that exactly what just happened here doesn't happen during the meeting. At this time, we're going to open up the floor for public comments. Anybody like to make a comment, we ask that you come up with a microphone, clearly state your name and address for the record, and make sure that you have signed in on the sign-in sheet in front. So far, we have 2 people who have signed in, Al Ferrandino and Dan. Al, do you want to go first?
I expect to be kind to
That was mowed out.
Well,
That's a camera.
yeah, that's the camera.
My name is Albert Ferrandino. I live at 55 Main Street, Stroudsburg. And why all this commotion about the building? So much history in that building that it would make everybody proud to be something about this building, this schoolhouse.
Al, that's actually why we're having the meeting tonight, is to talk about options for preservation grants and things like that for restoring the building. For the entire town. That's you have a microphone too.
And the residents.
So one of the things, Jesse, that I was reading, and I'll turn it over to Megan in a second. A lot of the stuff that's in the packets there is for like nonprofits, charities, governmental agencies, museums, and things like that. So there will probably be some follow-up stuff in the packet. Really is not geared around private citizens. So I'm sure there will be details on that, but the meat of what's here is in the packet is for like municipality stuff, specifically what we would be trying to do with the building.
Okay.
So now, yeah, the goal of this is to understand all the avenues of things, both sides of restoring it, what grants are available, and then as the counterpoint, what does it actually cost to put a new building in, and then we can compare the two apples to apples.
We have more important things to do than worry about that building.
Al, if we don't do anything with the building, it's gonna fall down.
Everything can be fixed.
Yes, that's why we're having this meeting, Al, is because we want to see if we can fix it.
Okay, I'm gonna be back on later on.
Okay. Dan, do you want to come up?
Okay. I'm actually going to turn my back to you folks
Just be sure to take
because I want to address the residents that are sitting here. No, I want to look at it. My name's Dan Klein, Alein, a German name. Okay, how many folks here know what Topahocken means? Land of turtles. Okay, yes, all right. Topahocken.
Dan, can I ask you to talk in this speaker so it picks up?
Topahocken.
Yeah,
It's not
being
Yeah,
picked
it's not the
up.
microphone, it's the proximity.
Topahocken encompasses 260,000 acres of land. It's 322 square miles. Okay? We all know how it was developed. We all know how it was developed and how your ancestors came down either the Susquehanna River or the Delaware River. And they finally decided to settle in this community. They brought with them their families, their children, their cattle, and they were here since 1723. In 1792, the Zion Lutheran Church was erected in Womelsdorf. The most historic indirect result of an event occurs when there is an positive action such as an anniversary, a centennial, or a celebration. While there are times that may cause by a negative reaction, we have a negative reaction. We have a building that needs restoration. That building needs to be repaired. That building is history. Okay? And I address the Township Board of Supervisors to consider Megan's proposal to restore this historic facility. It's not just there to be torn down.
I think I speak for Jesse and myself when I say we absolutely don't view it as just being there to be torn down. It's trying to get an understanding.
Yours doesn't work.
This one I think just doesn't work earlier. Our goal around this is to make sure that we're doing the best thing for the community. I understand the sentiment, the attachment. I like the building, one's working on personal note, but we need to make sure that it is something that can be fixed and that we have a mechanism in which to fix it. So that's where we're trying to get all of the details that we can, and we assembled that board that we're going to be appointing people to start taking in all of the information. So like I said earlier, we can make an educated decision as a board on one, is it cost feasible to do one way or the other, and then how do we do it? That's why we have Megan here tonight, is to try to explore some of the vehicles for how we do it.
History is our most important thing. It's what we pass on from generation to generation to generation. I'm not a resident, a born resident of Berks County. I was transplanted here. Okay? But I still love it. If I didn't, I'd leave it. And I don't want to see this building torn down.
Like I said, on a personal note, just anything else aside, I agree with you. I don't want to see it torn down. But again,
it has to be repaired. It has to be restored.
Believe me, we hear you loud and clear on that. But it's our fiduciary responsibility to make sure that we are doing the right thing from a long-term standpoint for, I'm going to be blunt, just say cost reasons. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. That's the whole point.
Then I'll sign it. Heather Hafer, 73 Main Street. Question for you, Megan. So there's no answer now. Hopefully it'll be in the presentation. But with Statues Park being part of the historic district or having historic buildings, I'm interested for the people of the town to know or to learn what happens when historic buildings are demolished or removed and how that impacts our historical standing. So I don't know if that's part of that, but if you could speak to that at some point, I think that will also be quite impactful for the building.
Any other comments? Okay, seeing none, I'll turn it over to Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here this evening. It's always a pleasure to be out in communities where there's big turnout for meetings. It's always nice to see lots of faces out in the crowd. I'm Megan McNish. I'm the Eastern Region Community Preservation Coordinator for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, which is a bureau of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. is the longest job title you will ever hear, and it tells you nothing about what I do. On a day-to-day basis, I work with communities and provide technical support for communities that are interested in historic preservation, organizations that are interested in historic preservation, kind of go-to gal. So tonight I'm going to be talking about what I like to call the dollars and cents of historic preservation, because ultimately preservation is what I do every day. It's not right for every community, but I'm hoping to tell you a little bit about why it might be right for you. So I want to start with what I mean by historic preservation. Ultimately, historic preservation is a conversation about our past, about our future. It provides us an opportunity to ask what's important in our history and what parts of our past can we preserve for the future. Through historic preservation, we can look at history in different ways and ask different questions about the past, learning both new things about our history and about ourselves. And in the local context, we can leverage historic places as we create a vision for what we want our communities to look like in the future. And there are a variety of preservation tools that exist that I'll talk about this evening that can be beneficial for communities. First tool I want to talk about, I think is on everybody's mind, is the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the nation's official list of properties that are recognized for significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and horticulture. The National Register is maintained by the National Park Service. It's a federal program, but it's administered in states by state historic preservation offices, which is the office that I work for under the umbrella of the Pennsylvania Historical Institution. Something that not a lot of people know is that the National Register recognizes properties with significance at the local, state, and national level. So properties don't have to be nationally significant to qualify for listing in the National Register. I think that's a really important piece of the National Register program too. It recognizes the importance of local contributions to the overall fabric of our history. You'll hear me say this a number of times. The National Register program listing in the National Register does not place any requirements or restrictions on private property owners. Unless there are state or federal funds, licenses, or permits involved in projects, just because you're listed on the National Register doesn't mean you can't go ahead and do whatever it is you want to do. In Pennsylvania, we have over 3,000 properties listed in the National Register, so it's a fairly robust program. I think all counties in Pennsylvania are represented, certainly Berks County has quite a few National Register listings. So how do you get a property listed in the National Register? The formal process begins with the State Historic Preservation Office with what's called the Determination of Eligibility, or DOE. This is where our office intakes information about a historic property and we evaluate whether or not it meets one of the 4 National Register listing criteria, A through D, and whether the property retains significance for the period, or excuse me, integrity for the period that it is significant. So I'll explain this in a little bit more detail so it makes more sense. But the 4 criteria, generally, criterion A focuses on the broad patterns of our history. So think things like agriculture, industry, education, those are all sort of broad categories for which a property can be significant under criterion A. Criterion B is properties associated with significant individuals in our past. This is a good example where we think oftentimes about the significant people in our past as being people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but it can also include people who are locally significant, whether it's a governor that lived here in Berks County or a mayor that made a significant advancement in a local effort. That can be a reason why a property is listed under criterion B. Criterion C is the general bucket we use for architecture and engineering. And then criterion D goes something like, has the potential to yield information about history or prehistory. And that's broadly been applied to archaeology. But in recent years, it's also been applied to some traditional building types, like some of the historic Pennsylvania German log cabins. What can we learn from those construction techniques? That's an important component of our past. We also look at, like I said, integrity. Integrity relies on 7 different components. Again, I know this is sounding really complicated at the moment, but I promise it'll get a little bit clearer. Integrity relies on location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Property does not have to retain all 7 aspects of integrity, or all 7 aspects to retain integrity. We just want to see that a majority of those aspects are still in place. So I'm going to use the example of this building I have up on the screen here. This is a historic meeting house here in Berks County that was listed in the National Register within the last 10 or 15 years. So we can clearly tell it's a meeting house, right? That speaks to us pretty clearly. And as we evaluate it for integrity, we can see that it retains the original stone exterior, wood windows and doors. It's in its original location, so it retains its location of integrity, original design, and largely setting. We can assume, materials are either the same, or if they've been replaced with what was there before. So this is a good example of how we take a look at and evaluate the integrity of a historic property. And when I say historic property, I mean not only individual buildings. The National Register also includes structures, so things like bridges or non-habitable buildings. Objects can also be listed in the National Register, landscapes and sites, and then historic districts, which is what I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. Historic districts are a significant concentration or linkage, continuity of sites, building structures and objects that are connected either aesthetically or by their physical development. Sounds like we've all, I was gonna say, does everyone know the historic district in Stachsburg? Sounds like that's wide community knowledge, which is great. You do have a National Register historic district there, and it was recognized in the 1980s as an important local example of a linear village. I do want to emphasize, though, that historic districts don't just include towns and villages, boroughs. They can also include agricultural areas as well. Ole Township here in Berks County is a pretty famous example of a National Register listed agricultural district that was recognized for how intact those historic farmsteads are and their interconnection with one another. So I want to be clear about what I'm talking about here too. National Register historic districts, I'm saying it again, they're not regulatory. They do create oversight for federal and state undertakings. Those are projects that are federally state funded, require state or federal licenses or permits. But they can also do some great things for property owners in the district. Eligible properties within historic districts, or contributing properties within historic districts could be eligible for historic preservation tax credits. They're income producing properties, and then nonprofits that may own property within the district, including local governments, may also be eligible for grants as well. Local historic districts, on the other hand, are the regulatory tool that exists in Pennsylvania to manage how change happens to historic properties. So just to break it down a little bit more, the National Register recognizes the importance of buildings, structures, objects, sites, and historic districts for their importance to local, state, or national history, but it does not prevent the demolition of historic properties by federal, state, local, or private development. I mentioned federal and state undertakings previously. Ultimately, what National Register listing does, or even eligibility does for communities, In the case of federal and state undertakings, is it gives you a seat at the table. Gives you an opportunity to comment and to convey to federal and state agencies the importance, or maybe not importance, of the historic resources to you within your community. Maybe there's a building that you really, really care about that a federal project could affect, and you want to make sure your voice is heard. The National Register can help be an avenue to have that happen. Maybe there's a building that you don't care about, and something's going to happen to it. It still gives you a seat at the table and an opportunity to convey those sentiments. The National Register also encourages preservation through documenting historic properties and their significance. It's also a point of pride for many communities to have properties listed in the National Register. And it also assists, again, in facilitating review by the State Historic Preservation Office. We help coordinate reviews of state and federal projects. Local designation, on the other hand, like I said, is what can regulate demolition and relocation of historic properties, restrict and regulate the maintenance, repair, and restoration of properties. You can also review new construction through historic designation. And it's really what gives you the teeth to be able to regulate and protect historic resources. So thinking about, now we've talked about some of the hard no's, right? The regulation, what comes, strings are attached. But let's talk a little bit about the benefits of National Register listing. So I mentioned that income producing historic properties that are contributing to a listed historic district could be eligible for federal and state historic preservation tax credits. The federal program provides a percentage credit equal to the overall rehabilitation costs, where the state program provides a fixed dollar amount for historic tax credits. Federal program is rolling, the state program has a specific deadline, although our cap was raised last year from $5 million to $20 million, which is a great thing for folks who are rehabilitating historic properties across Pennsylvania. What we see frequently in my office is that for smaller scale projects that are looking to take advantage of historic preservation tax credits, the cost of hiring a consultant to go through the process of listing a property in the National Register, it's not required, but it's often the route that folks pursuing tax credits take. For smaller scale projects, it doesn't really, math doesn't work out. But you already have a listed historic district here, so folks who are considered contributing to that district could take advantage of this program, which really removes a significant barrier for some of those smaller scale projects. So that's a great asset to have in your back pocket. Correct, yes, income producing properties is businesses. There have been instances where, for example, property owners who own a bed and breakfast and also live on the property have taken advantage of this program, but it gets a little bit tricky because particularly for the federal program, my mom was a retirement specialist for many, many years. And I learned at a young age that when you get the IRS involved, things get complicated very quickly. And to claim the federal tax credit, you do have to do that through the IRS. So it is a little bit complicated. It can be done, but it's a little bit complicated. On the flip side of things, for nonprofits and local governments, grants are often a great benefit that come along with listing in the National Register. The office that I work for, the State Historic Preservation Office, has two different grant programs that can be a good fit for nonprofits within National Register districts. The Keystone Historic Preservation Planning and Construction Grants. So the two different categories, the planning grant focuses on projects like reuse studies, National Register nominations, architectural renderings and plans for, projects related to historic buildings. There's a wide range that can be encompassed in that category. The maximum award amount for that category is $25,000. The program does have a 50-50 cash match. So $50,000 project could get awarded at that maximum $25,000 amount. Our Keystone Preservation Grant Manager is fabulous to work with. She is really flexible on the source of match funding. Many grant programs have really specific requirements about where match can come from. But she's very flexible. Private donations, municipal funds, other grant programs. She's seen it all and is willing to make most things work. The companion program to the planning grant is the construction grant. That's going to be for your physical bricks and mortar projects. And the maximum award for that category is $100,000. What can be included in the construction category is not only things like repairing and replacing roofs, repointing for brick and mortar. It can also include things like ADA accessibility for historic buildings. That's a really important thing to be able to get people in so that it can continue to be used and live on for future generations. As you've likely gathered from what I've mentioned already, the property has to be eligible for or listed in the National Register. And again, in the case of historic district, should be contributing to the district. Eligible grantees include not only nonprofits and local governments, but also colleges and universities, museums. Just about anybody who has nonprofit status can apply to this program. And there are other programs beyond just the Keystone program in terms of grant funding available for historic properties. But these are two that are very popular in Pennsylvania. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about local historic preservation. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of how you do that, I want to talk about why communities choose preservation as their local policy. Local historic preservation is really, at the end of the day, a community and economic development strategy, which centers planning for the future around the model and kind of guiding point of older and historic places. These are often the places that make our community unique and special, and why we choose to continue to live in them. And preservation as a policy can encourage development which supports our community character and aligns with our overall community goals. I do want to emphasize that preservation is not about preventing development. It's not about freezing things in time, but rather managing change over time. Again, to ensure that the growth of our community, the change in our community aligns with our vision for where we see ourselves in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. I would say in general, the avenue to the best results with local historic preservation or historic preservation in general is through the use of regulatory tools. That's where you often see the greatest impact. This, generally speaking, requires property owners to maintain their property to a certain degree, or certain standard rather, and allows review of projects either associated with designated resources or within historic districts. Typically, historic preservation regulation allows your supervisors to say yes or no to projects based on recommendation of a historic preservation review body. That's not how you have to do preservation. That's not the only avenue. Preservation can also be a local policy through non-regulatory tools, using things like design guidelines where you outline best practices for folks to guide them towards historic preservation, or even doing things like aligning your underlying zoning with historic uses of properties. doesn't sound like a terribly exciting thing, but, on occasion, zoning can actually inadvertently encourage demolition rather than encourage reuse. So if you align those two things, it can help property owners choose reuse rather than demolition. So again, I like detail. And I want to talk a little bit more about what local historic preservation does and does not do. Again, managing change in your community is the biggest benefit to regulatory preservation tools. Proactively planning for historic resources, property owners who know they live in a historic district have an expectation of having to do things a certain way, and creating parameters in which property owners can do those sorts of things. It is really important in terms of expectation that we not assume that a historic district or a historic designation is absolutely going to prohibit the demolition of a historic property. There are instances where in local historic districts and with local designation where demolition is appropriate and should be approved. But what we want to see with local historic districts is that it's the last resort, that it's the last choice that's made, and you're only choosing demolition because you really don't have another viable option. Local historic preservation also does not automatically create takings through its regulation. That's been pretty well outlined in relevant case law in both Pennsylvania and in federal courts. And again, it's not going to prohibit any change to a historic property, but just ensure that that change is sympathetic to the historic fabric. And it doesn't automatically create a burden on property owners either. Often, the design review assistance that's given through the preservation review process can be extremely valuable to property owners. Before I came to the State Historic Preservation Office, I was a local historic preservation planner, and I helped people navigate that process. And I can't tell you how many times someone's not happy that they had to go through at the beginning, but at the end of the day, they said, wow, I'm really grateful for the assistance and the changes that we ended up making to this project. It's a better project because of it. So it can be a really positive experience for property owners and residents. As far as non-regulatory tools go, I already mentioned aligning zoning and historic building use. That's a really quick and easy way to get at some of these issues, but form-based code can also be a great solution. It's a more intensive undertaking, but it really focuses more on building form and design than it does on the use of properties. So it can create some good opportunities. Then again, too, we already talked about design guidelines and design guides and how they can be a tool to help property owners. You can also create incentives for preservation or rehabilitation versus demolition. And sometimes those are financial incentives, but sometimes they're things like zoning incentives, whether in a commercial district, it's reduction of parking requirements to help a new business come into your community, or adding additional lot coverage for preservation versus demolition for historic residences. So there are lots of different options that communities can and have pursued. Some of them, do cost township something, but some of them don't. And that's it's great to have some options to choose from. So I've sort of danced around this issue a little bit about what are the benefits. It's great to talk about our history and what we think for the future, but what does historic preservation actually do for us as a community? And I have a variety of things up here on the screen currently. they're all interconnected with one another. There's a variety of benefits that I could have put up here that I didn't, but these are the salient points that I really want to talk about. The first thing is sense of place. Several years ago, I came across a TED Talk from Ed McMahon called Anywhere USA. When I say Anywhere USA, you can probably picture something in your mind. But what he was really talking about was sort of what you see right when you get off the interstate, right? Lines of gas stations and, you know, fast food restaurants and things like that. And that has its place, right? I mean, we all need to fill up our car somewhere. We all need to get gas. But those aren't necessarily places, one, we really have lots of memories of, and two, that we find ourselves gravitating back towards. So what Mr. McMahon was talking about is that what makes our communities unique, what makes you realize that you're in Marion Township and not just anywhere else in the USA, is something that's really valuable, not only to our community identity and pride, pride of where we live. That's really important. People don't want to live in places they're not proud of. But it's also something that you can leverage for economic development. People want to visit unique places. They want to visit somewhere USA, not anywhere USA. So that sense of place often is made up of your historic buildings, the historic fabric of your community. And that's not something to blink an eye at. I think we often take for granted the communities that we live in. But every community has something special that's worth protecting for future generations. So leveraging that to get other people to come here and see how great it is can be extremely valuable for the business bottom line as well. More obvious benefit of preservation is our culture and our history. Protecting places helps us tell our stories as communities. And again, this is very interconnected to sense of place. You can't, in many ways, have retained culture and history without retaining a sense of place. But culture and history can also be an attraction through things like heritage tourism. And I'm not saying everybody's got to be, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I went to school there. I loved it. I had a great time. But I know that's not always attractive to all communities. But I put up on the screen here, Charming Forge. It's a great example of this area's iron and steel heritage. People are interested in learning more about aspects of both their own past, but also Pennsylvania's history. And these types of resources are rapidly disappearing from the landscape of Pennsylvania. But they played a really important role in our development and how we got to where we are today. So creating opportunities for people to come and visit places that help shape our past as Pennsylvanians can be really lucrative financially. What we find time and time again is that people who visit places for heritage tourism tend to spend more time in those places and they tend to spend more money. And that is a great thing for businesses. Which leads me into my next point about economic development. Several years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation published a really fantastic report called the Older, Better, Smaller Report. And what they found is that historic properties tended to provide greater opportunities for small businesses than new buildings. In general, these spaces were of varying sizes, often smaller in historic places than they are in new buildings. And it was a great entry point for people, just starting off, just opening their business, and they, don't necessarily have a lot of capital. And anyone has run across, the Pennsylvania Downtown Center and the Main Street, ideology. The idea is that small businesses make communities really attractive to people. Most folks would rather go to a local coffee shop than, a chain. A place where somebody is gonna recognize you the next time you go in and maybe they'll remember your order. That's something really special and it's an important part of what it means to live in a community. Similarly though, preservation versus new construction also can have a really big impact on local economy. Generally speaking, the costs associated with preservation are those related to labor, physical labor. Whereas with new construction, the vast majority of cost often goes to materials. What we find with the breakdown between labor and materials is that generally labor is local. And when labor is local, about 70% of the cost of labor is going to stay in your local economy. That's not necessarily the case with materials. It varies community to community depending on the resources that you have, but by and large, more money is going to stay in your community for costs associated with preservation. There have also been some great studies on the values of designated historic properties versus the value of non-designated properties. And what has been shown in communities from east coast to west coast, north to south, is that properties that are locally designated for historic preservation purposes tend to retain their value better than those that are not designated. They tend to weather economic upturns and downturns better. They tend to be a lot more stable. And some of that is because living in a historic district creates predictability. There's parameters within which people can do certain things and generally not do others. And that has a benefit in terms of what your return on investment is for a property. This is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I promise as I explain it, it'll make a little bit more sense. What we also find with historic properties is that there's greater variety in terms of size and scale, and that can help whether it's new buyers, return buyers, folks who are looking to downsize. It provides greater options and can make housing more accessible to a variety of groups of people, whether it's, like I said, first-time home buyers or folks who are just looking to have something a little bit smaller as they age. But because there's that greater variety, there's greater accessibility for those groups. I know sustainability and environmental benefits are not to everybody's interest, but bear with me as I explain this. Because I think whether you're an avid environmentalist or not, we can all see some value in using something that's well made and making the most out of the things that we have. I think about some of the great pieces of clothing that I've purchased over the years that, every once in a while, maybe they just need a little bit of mending, but then they're good as new. I don't throw a shirt away just because the hem maybe started to come out a little bit. It's a pretty easy fix, and then I can wear that shirt for another 10, 15, or 20 years. And it's really the same with historic buildings. Making the most out of the building stock that we have can provide a variety of benefits. First, it makes the most out of the embodied energy that exists within a building. Embodied energy is the amount of effort and energy it takes to both extract the resources to build a building, and then the energy that it takes to actually put it up. The longer you use a building, the more you get out of the embodied energy, the more efficient it is. Often, historic buildings were also designed with things like airflow, and cross breezes in mind as well. If you've ever been in an old house on a hot day and all the doors and windows are open, it's definitely cooler. It cools down pretty quick. So our ancestors had some good thoughts and ideas on how to manage temperature, even without the benefits of modern HVAC systems. Not that those things aren't also important, but our historic buildings have some efficiency already built in. And then there's historic materials themselves. More often than not, buildings that make up, or materials that make up historic buildings are much better than what we can buy today. If you've ever gone online and seen a cross section of modern wood next to wood harvested in the 1920s, the difference is pretty dramatic. That wood that's much denser tends to be rot resistant, termite resistant, and like I said, money cannot buy that kind of material today. Individual components of historic buildings were also often meant to be repaired and reused rather than completely replaced. So a historic wood window is a great example of that. The individual component pieces and parts of those windows were intended to come apart, and then if you had a rotten piece, you could replace it and put the window back together and it would be good as new. I really can't do that with many modern materials. I heard a contractor say one time, someone tells you that something is maintenance free, run the other way. So it means you can't fix it. And that's, I think, generally true with most modern materials. For most historic materials, when they've lived their useful lives, the vast majority of them can be recycled. Whether it's wood that will decompose on its own, bricks can be recycled, tin roofs are infinitely recyclable. And when we do that, rather than put things in the landfill, that can be helpful for us in the long run. The less that goes into the landfill now, further out, we need to think about where the new landfill is going to go. So there's a practical component to why some of these sustainability and environmental benefits may be of interest. And then last but not least, looking to the future. It sounds counterintuitive, but as we said at the beginning, historic preservation is really a conversation with our past about our future. It gives us an opportunity to ask questions about where we want our community to be in the coming years. What do we want our communities to look like for our children, for our children's children? What's important about our community that we want to pass on to future generations? And how can we do that? So historic places can be an important way to ground conversations about our future. And I'll leave you with two quotes from, two of my favorite quotes about preservation from the former president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Richard Mell. He says, when you strip away the rhetoric, historic preservation is simply having good sense to hold on to things that are well designed, that link us with our past in a meaningful way and have plenty of good use left in them. And there may have been a time when preservation was about saving an old building here or there, but those days are gone. Preservation is in the business of saving communities and the values that they embody. So with that, I'm eager for your questions.
Thank you, Megan.
Megan was kind enough to give us some packets of information. So if anyone wants it, we only have a limited amount. So I would say if you want to come by the office, the hours are Monday through Thursday, 8 to 4. We can make you up some copies if you're interested in having all the stuff in detail in packets here. Thank you.
We'll also make sure that the details are up on the website.
Yeah,
well.
she could email me some stuff now.
I also have, business cards with me this evening, if anybody wants my contact information to reach out with additional questions or, resources in the future. I'm very happy to continue our conversation beyond this evening.
Any questions?
I have a question. What's the age of a building have to be before it's really classified as a historical building? Excuse me? Younger than me?
50 years, I think.
Yes, so for the
That
National
was me.
Register.
I'll take it upon myself.
And for record, that was Dan Klein answering that question.
For the
That
National
more hurt
Register.
than that remark.
I have other questions.
The general guideline is 50 years,
Okay.
but there is a mechanism to list things that are less than 50 years. Doesn't happen very often, but it does on occasion. I didn't get into this whole other layer of complicated things, but there, in addition to the 4 National Register criteria, there's also something called the criteria considerations. And one of those considerations is properties that have exceptional significance to be listed within 50 years. So, for example, the site of the Flight 93 crash, that is listed, all National Park Service sites, if you didn't know this, are listed in the National Register. That is listed, even though it's obviously well within 50 years. So it does happen from time to time, even for properties that are not national park sites.
Ready for the next one? How many people go down to Lidditz? How many people enjoy? I don't need that, I can talk loud enough. And it only makes my voice. So how many people go down to Lidditz and enjoy walking through those nice old stores and buildings down there? Lots of people, we all do. Our community can be the same way. We can go one of 2 directions. We can restore it, or we can let it go away. It's kind of our choice. It's the residents' choice. The residents have to put the pressure on the township supervisors. I'm sorry to say it, but you folks are the ones that control this situation. And these people are here to tell you they want that building preserved. And we have to do whatever we can to preserve it. And Megan's presentation was a wonderful presentation, but I think some of these people really wanted to hear about their schoolhouse and what needs to be done to it.
So again, the preference definitely is restoring it, but I'll go on record and say that it is our due diligence to have the comparison in place so that everybody understands. I'm gonna make up numbers here, this is purely fictitious, that it's $100 to build a new building or $300 to repair the building, that you have to weigh the 2 very carefully against each other in terms of what that will do to a budget over a 10, 20, 30-year span. So with that said, I have been taking notes all night, and there's a number of things that I'm going to bring up on Saturday, not to bring it up too fast here, but we missed the cutoff for this year's submission on things. But one of the things that would potentially be eligible for that would be the planning and design of what we would do to remediate the building. And also some of the construction. For example, we tried to tackle something next year and asked for grant funding. We can specifically focus on that rear wall, which is one of the biggest problems that the building faces right now. So there are some things that are formulating and how best to go about doing it, because I don't think anybody here is going to disagree with you that it's great to restore the building. On the surface, 100% agree with you. How do we do it? Can we do it? How do we make it work? So we have to figure out the mechanisms, the time frame, the budgeting, everything that goes along with making sure that works. Everything else is.
And I think I had mentioned it at a previous meeting, ideally, if there would be someone in the community that would want to start up a 501c3, that would be a good spearhead to have funds. After Megan's presentation, that would also be able to be a resource for anyone in the community who wants to do property improvements. It would be an excellent contact point. And that group ideally could be the conversation between Megan and any residents interested in improvements. So I'm gonna throw that back out to you guys. We have limited resources as a township. We function off of a $600,000 a year budget. And I hate to say, a lot of that does go to road improvements. And we don't get much money from the state. And currently, as I'm sitting on the board, I'm not willing to raise property taxes. Unfortunately, we all pay a hefty price when it comes to school taxes, but we want to support our children in our community as well. So again, tossing it back out to the community, we'll do whatever we can to help you guys, but if someone wants to take the step and form a 501c3.
Is the community association, there's nothing in their bylaws?
They could certainly do, they could shift gears, but they would have to check with the state because their mission statement and their filing papers say one thing. So they may have to check with the state to see if they could shift gears. But we're talking about hefty fundraising here. Someone who is savvy enough to create a website, to go out into the community and go beyond our community, nationally, internationally to raise funds. So this is a doable project, but it's a big project, and we know that it's going to be extremely costly. It may not happen overnight, it may take a few years, but if people are willing to commit to participating and doing it, I can see it happening. But it's something financially that I don't think is gonna necessarily fall back onto the township, not without significant increase in taxes, which I don't think anyone wants to pay.
I actually figured this out the one year, to get an additional $10,000 in usable revenue for the township, we would have to raise taxes by 1 whole mil, not a tenth of a mil, but a whole mil. So to go from where we are now, operating budget wise, to put an additional $100,000 means we would have to go up 10 mils. And I personally am not comfortable going from 2 point something to 12 point something. That's a horrible thing. So we have to think outside of the box, and we have to try to go after grants. We have to try to encourage community involvement. All of these things are complicated, and like Irene said, take time and immense amount of effort.
It's gonna take a year.
So this is where, like I said, everybody feels the wheels of government spin slowly. They do, to be honest, but it takes, sometimes the speed is there for a reason. So that way we can get our bearings around us, again, make good informed decisions and have time to properly get things outlined and executed so that it's done in the best possible way.
I just want to address a point that Irene brought up. Organizations don't have to be preservation focused to apply for Keystone grants. If the organization doesn't own the building in question, just agreement of the property owner is what's needed to apply for grant funds, but they don't have to have preservation for the school as part of their mission.
So as a curiosity, how would that work if, let's say, the community association is applying for grants? Would they be able to apply for grants on behalf of homeowners who wouldn't normally be eligible for those grants because they're a charity or a 501c3? No, okay.
No, unfortunately, organizations can't apply for this particular grant program. There is a National Park Service grant program called the Paul Green Grant. It focuses on rural communities and state properties in rural communities. They use the USDA commission. So you have to look up to make sure that your community qualifies, but those funds can be given to private property owners for improvements. And it typically relies on some kind of overarching either nonprofit or local government organization applying for the funds and then having criteria for how they're going to distribute those funds. But I'm very happy to spend more information.
Yeah, appreciate it.
What about the meeting committee that's gonna be made up? can they apply for?
No, they're part of Marion Township, so it would be effectively us. Or I should say, they're part of the municipal entity of Marion Township.
But could they do fundraisers and stuff like that?
We'd have to check with Colin, because they are still part of the governmental entity. They're not a separate thing. Like, for example, the community association fundraise like crazy. And they can work with us on applying for grants for like the playground and things. Even though we own the playground, they're able to kind of interface with us, and they have things that they're available that we don't have. The board, on the other hand, much like Board of Supervisors, is a component of Marion Township, the municipal entity.
Yeah, Colin did mention that we could fundraise,
Yeah.
but it would have to be extremely clear on its face that there's no services being rendered in exchange for a donation or other privileges, so, yeah. I mean, again, ideally, if you had a 501c3 that would focus on this, this would be ideal.
Dan, can you pass the mic to Matt?
Matt?
I don't need a mic either, I don't think, but.
It helps, no matter how loud.
It helps for the recording.
For 60 football on the road. I just have a simple question. Is a project like this, rather than getting grants, raising taxes to generate all the funds, is something like this bankable? Are the construction loans, could the township take out a 20 or 30-year construction loan, perhaps underwritten by or endorsed by the state?
So, I don't believe the state has ever done, any kind of loan program or loan signing kind of program. Communities have pursued things like bonds in the past, to raise funds, for local projects. As far as grants go, typically, you're permitted to apply for each grant program, you're permitted to apply for one project and close that project out before you can go and apply for another. So for example, the Keystone program, we have two sort of tracks, planning and construction. You have to pick one or the other. Once project is done, let's say, for example, pursue plans, architectural, plans for restoration of the building. Once that project is closed out, whoever is ultimately the applicant could then come back in for a construction grant and ask for money to actually implement those plans that were funded just as an
I got a question for you, Megan. So, it's sort of not my.
Hold on.
Grow it.
I can talk loud.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So in the historical district of Stoutsburg, there's buildings labeled significant, buildings that are labeled supported. Does it affect the community's historical district if majority of the significant buildings start getting torn down?
So it's very rare that they remove things from the National Register, but it does happen on occasion. It's not the choice that we want to make. We want that record to exist for the future. But certainly it could have ripple effects on eligibility for things like tax credits. In the community that I live in, there's a property as a historic firehouse. It's been listed in the National Register, I think since the 1970s, which goes back to the early days of this program, and just for building or documentation. But this building has been listed in the National Register for a very long time, and it sat vacant for many, many, many years. And a developer came along and bought the property, was going to use historic preservation tax credits, and the Park Service said that too much had changed around that building for them to claim their federal credit. The building is in what's now a super block, so it had formerly been there was a street running through it. Now it's just one big campus, and it was a really unfortunate circumstance on a lot of levels. It was a great project. It was had a really great preservation ethic, but because of what had happened around that building, those folks were not able to actually give them credit despite the great work that they did. So that's just one real life example of the impact that demolition can have on them.
Okay, so we don't have many buildings on register inventory that are significant. For the record, the school building is labeled significant. So is our fire home house. They're restoring it right now. I'm glad to see that building saved. I think a couple more, maybe 2 other ones. So there's not many on that historical register that are labeled significant. The more we lose, I'm worried about it affecting everything.
And I will say the way that we identify properties in a historic district in terms of what we call the inventory, which is just the list of all the buildings that are in the district. We talk about them a little bit differently than we did when the district was listed. So when we look at contributing or non-contributing, certainly there are some buildings in the district that help tell the story better than others, but we look at it a little bit less nuance maybe than we did in the 1980s. So we just look at contributing or non-contributing, but certainly those buildings that are identified as being significant in your district play an important role in ensuring that it continues to tell the story that it was listed for.
Any other questions?
Is the inventory online?
Yes, so the inventory and all of the National Register documentation exists on a site called PA Share. That's our online data management portal. If you have trouble accessing it, I'd be happy to send it to you directly. It is not always the easiest system to navigate, and I recognize that. So if I can help you find information, I'm very happy to do that.
Megan's also gonna email me some stuff tomorrow, and I had that stuff printed out at the office and at the meetings for everybody when they come.
Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
I'm sharing all this.
Thank you all again for having me. It was real good.
Second. Now, you don't know yet.
Second.
Third, second.
Peter, second by Irene, roll call Peter, Irene, that's it.
Okay, thank you.